There's a special kind of quiet that lives only in the deep woods. It's more than just an absence of noise. It's a presence. A heavy, listening silence that seems to remember everything that's ever happened under its canopy. I've felt it myself, many times, but I never truly understood it until I came across the journal of an old park ranger, a man who spent 40 years of his life walking the trails of a place the locals call the Silent Forest. His name was Arthur Vance, and his journal, bound in cracked, dry leather, smelled of mildew and thyme and a deep, abiding sorrow. Most of it was just what you'd expect. Notes on trail maintenance, animal sightings, the changing of the seasons, but threaded throughout the years like a dark, ugly stitch was his private record of the ones who went in and never came out, the unsolved disappearances. He wrote about them not like a lawman, but like a priest recording the confessions of a place he knew was damned. There was a pattern he'd noticed one the official reports always missed. It was almost always couples. Often they were trying to mend something broken between them. And in nearly every case a small, insignificant object was found left behind in their abandoned campsite. A single glove, a dropped pocket knife, a child's forgotten toy. As if they'd found something that didn't belong to them, and in picking it up had agreed to a transaction they didn't understand. The official cause of death, when they were found at all, was always exposure or a tragic accident. But Arthur Vance, in the shaky handwriting of his final years, offered a different theory. He wasn't a superstitious man, but 40 years in that silence had taught him things. It taught him about loneliness. And it leads me to ask you a question, the same one Arthur posed on the last page of his journal. What happens when a spirit becomes so lonely, so desperate for a playmate, that it would do anything to force you to stay and play with it? Forever? This is the story of Mark and Sarah, and the game they were invited to play. The silence in the car was a physical thing. It had weight and texture with sharp, dangerous edges. It was the kind of silence that grows in the empty spaces left behind by a life that is no longer there. The silence of a child's empty bedroom, of a toy box left untouched. For the past year, this silence had been Mark and Sarah's constant, unwelcome companion, and now they had brought it with them on the road. Mark kept his eyes fixed on the grey ribbon of highway unwinding before them. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, a pointless tension. He was driving, but his mind was 1,000 miles away, stuck in a loop of a single, terrible day. A flash of yellow from a school bus on the opposite side of the road sent a jolt through his chest, and he forced his attention back to the speedometer, his jaw tight. He hadn't really seen his wife in months, not even now, sitting right beside him. He saw only a ghost, a silhouette of the woman she used to be. Sarah, for her part, stared out the passenger window, her reflection a pale, translucent mask against the blur of passing trees. She watched the world go by, but none of it registered. Her world had shrunk to the size of a memory, a space just large enough for 3 people, one of whom was now forever out of reach. Her thumb traced the worn-out photo of their son, Josh, on her phone's lock screen. It was a pointless, repetitive gesture, a prayer to a God she no longer believed in. They used to love the quiet between them. Now it was a canyon, carved out by everything they couldn't bring themselves to say. It had been a year since they'd lost Josh, a year of sleeping in separate rooms, of meals eaten in silence, of two people drowning in the same ocean but unable to reach for each other. This trip, this desperate flight into the wilderness of the silent forest, was a therapist's suggestion. A last-ditch effort to find some piece of the people they were before their world had ended. They were running not toward a shared future, but away from a house that had become a museum of their grief. As the city fell away behind them, replaced by lonely stretches of farmland and then the dark, encroaching pines, the silence in the car seemed to merge with the immense, ancient quiet of the land itself. They hadn't spoken a word in over an hour, but the story of their pain was screaming in the space between them, a silent, desperate howl that the deep woods seemed to welcome and understand completely. The spot they chose was beautiful, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by a fortress of silent, ancient pines. A thick carpet of fallen needles made the ground soft under their feet, and the air was sharp and clean. For a moment, as they began to unpack, a fragile sense of peace settled over them. It felt far away from everything, a place where the ghosts of their past might not be able to follow. It was Sarah who found the bird. While clearing leaves and twigs from the spot where they would lay their tent, her fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. She dug it out of the damp earth. It was a small, hand-carved toy, a wooden bird with its wings half spread, painted a pale robin's egg blue. The paint was faded and chipped, and one of the delicate wings had a small splinter missing from its tip. It was a lonely, broken-looking thing, and a wave of profound melancholy washed over her. She saw not a piece of discarded wood, but a story of loss, an echo of her own. She couldn't bring herself to toss it aside. Instead, she gently wiped the dirt from it and placed it on a large, flat stone near where the fire pit would be, like a small monument. She didn't know it, of course, but the gesture was a signature, a quiet, unknowing agreement. The first player had just accepted the invitation to the game. While she was lost in thought, Mark scanned the perimeter of their clearing. He was a practical man, and his unease was looking for a source, a tangible threat. His eyes landed on it almost immediately. Standing at the far edge of the clearing, separate from the other trees, was an enormous, gnarled oak. It was ancient, its bark thick and deeply furrowed like an old man's skin, but it was the base of the tree that held his gaze. A large, dark hollow gaped open at the roots, an unblinking black mouth in the side of the massive trunk. It didn't look like a natural part of the tree. It looked like an entrance, a place to hide, a place to wait. A shiver of pure, primal dread traced its way up his spine. He said nothing to Sarah, but he made a silent promise to himself to keep his distance from it. Night fell, and they sat by the fire, the flames pushing back the immense, pressing darkness. The silence between them had returned, heavy and familiar. To fill the void, to soothe the raw ache in her own chest, Sarah began to hum. It was a soft, absent-minded sound at first, a melody that rose from a place of deep memory. It was the lullaby she used to sing to Josh every single night. The simple, sorrowful tune drifted out from the firelight and was swallowed by the listening woods. She was humming a song of comfort and grief, unaware that she was also broadcasting the perfect theme music for the game that was about to begin. The fire had dwindled to a pulsating bed of embers, casting a weak, orange glow against the thin nylon walls of the tent. Outside, the forest had fallen into its deepest hush, a profound silence that seemed to press in on them, magnifying the sound of their own breathing. Mark and Sarah lay in their separate sleeping bags, a foot of cold, empty space between them, both pretending to be asleep. Sleep was an impossible luxury, a forgotten country they could no longer visit. They were just waiting for the night to end. That's when they heard it. It was not a sound of the woods. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was a voice, a child's voice, and it was so close it sounded as if it were whispered directly into the fabric of the tent. It was a clear, articulate whisper, devoid of any real emotion, a simple declaration of fact. "Ready or not, here I come." Mark froze, every muscle in his body going rigid. He sat bolt upright, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He looked at Sarah. In the faint, dying glow of the embers, he could see her eyes were wide open, two circles of pure, distilled terror. She hadn't been asleep either. She had heard it too. For a long moment they didn't move, didn't breathe, straining their ears against the crushing silence that followed. There was nothing, just the low hiss of the cooling embers. Cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate, Mark reached for the zipper on the tent flap. He pulled it down just an inch, creating a tiny crack through which he could see the clearing. There was nothing there, only the soft orange pulse of the fire's remains and the impassive black silhouettes of the trees standing guard in the darkness. No footprints in the dirt. No sign of a lost child, no source for the voice. He zipped the tent shut, his hands shaking. "The wind," he whispered, the words sounding hollow and false, even to his own ears. "You can hear strange things in the wind out here." Sarah didn't answer. She just squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. They lay there with the rest of the night, two strangers on a cold, dark island, listening. But the voice did not come again. They didn't know it yet, couldn't have known it, but their silence didn't matter. The game had already been declared, and in the great, dark wilderness of the silent forest, they were now officially it. The sun rose, but it brought no comfort. Morning in the silent forest was a cold, grey affair, the light struggling to pierce the thick canopy, illuminating a world that now seemed hostile and alien. They emerged from the tent stiff and unrested, their eyes burning from a night of sleepless, listening terror. The whisper from the darkness had replayed itself in their minds 1,000 times, a taunting, childish promise. They moved about the campsite with a shared, unspoken dread, every action heavy with the fear of what they might find. It was Sarah who noticed it first. She was packing away some of the food, her hands shaking, when she glanced at the small mesh pocket inside the tent where she had placed the wooden bird the night before. The pocket was empty. A cold fist of panic clenched in her stomach. She frantically searched her sleeping bag, then Mark's, her breathing growing short and ragged. "It's gone," she said, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "The bird, it's gone." Mark, who was staring out at the woods as if expecting an attack at any moment, turned his head. His eyes scanned the clearing, and then he froze. "No, it's not," he said, his voice low and dead. He pointed. On the large, flat stone where Sarah had first placed it 2 days ago, the little wooden bird sat. It was perched perfectly upright, a silent, painted sentinel in the grey morning light. It hadn't been there when they came out of the tent, they were sure of it. but it was where it was pointing that made the blood freeze in their veins. Its small carved beak, with the tiny chip missing from the end, was aimed with the unwavering precision of a compass needle. It wasn't pointing randomly into the woods. It was pointing directly, unequivocally, at the dark, gaping mouth of the hollow oak tree. Mark walked a slow, deliberate circle around the stone, his eyes scanning the soft earth. There was nothing. No footprints, no tracks, no sign that anything had touched it. It had simply appeared. The whisper from the night before echoed in their minds. Ready or not, here I come. They looked from the bird to the tree, the horrifying connection undeniable. This wasn't just a misplaced toy. It was a message. It was a map. The game had begun, and the lonely ghost was patiently showing them the way to the board. The discovery of the wooden bird's impossible journey left them paralyzed. For an hour, they simply sat by the dead fire, staring at the small, painted object that now pointed accusingly toward the hollow oak. The denial they had clung to was gone, leaving them naked and exposed to the terrifying truth. They were not alone, and they were caught in something they didn't understand. It was Mark who finally broke the trance. "We have to find a ranger," he said, his voice a low, determined rasp. "There has to be someone in charge of this place, an office, a station, something." The idea of authority, of a sane explanation, was a sliver of hope in a world that had abandoned all logic. They packed a small bag, leaving the tent and the rest of their gear behind, as if marking their intention to return, a small lie they both needed to believe. They didn't know where they were going, only that they couldn't stay there. They followed barely their path, calling out every few minutes, their voices sounding small and foolish against the immense silence. After nearly an hour of fruitless hiking, they smelled it. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. Hope surged through them, raw and desperate. They crashed through the underbrush, following the scent until they broke through into another small clearing. In the center stood a small, rustic cabin, a thin curl of grey smoke rising from its stone chimney. An old man in a worn flannel shirt and faded jeans stood outside, methodically chopping firewood. He was the first human being they had seen in 2 days. He looked up as they approached, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue. He didn't seem surprised to see them. He simply rested his axe and waited. "Excuse me," Mark began, panting. We were camping down by the creek. We need to report something strange." The old ranger's eyes flickered between Mark's frantic expression and Sarah's pale, terrified face. And then he saw it. He saw the little wooden bird clutched in Sarah's white-knuckled hand. The change was immediate and profound. The color drained from the old man's weathered face, leaving it a sickly, greyish-white. The friendly, tired curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a look of pure, undiluted horror, a deep and ancient fear. The axe slipped from his hand and thudded softly onto the damp earth. His watery blue eyes were fixed on the toy, and only the toy. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a dry, cracking whisper. "Dear God," he breathed. Where did you find that?" Sarah stammered, pointing a trembling hand back in the vague direction of their campsite. Under some leaves, near a big, hollow oak tree." At the mention of the oak tree, a pained expression like a fresh wave of grief washed over the old man's face. He closed his eyes for a moment, and a single, heavy sigh escaped his lips. When he opened them again, the fear was gone, replaced by a profound and chilling weariness. He didn't look at them. He looked past them, his gaze fixed on the dark, oppressive line of trees that bordered his small clearing. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and flat. "Don't pack. Just get in your car and drive. Don't stop until you see pavement. Don't even think about waiting for nightfall." "Leave? Why?" Mark demanded, stepping forward. "What is that thing? Who is Leo?" The ranger's eyes snapped back to him, sharp and angry for a second. "You're camped near Leo's hiding spot," he said, his voice dropping again, as if afraid the woods themselves might be listening. "You should have never gone near that tree." His gaze then fell to the wooden bird still clutched in Sarah's hand. The look on his face was one of absolute pity, the look a man gives to something that is already dead. "You picked it up," he stated, not a question but a final, grim diagnosis. "He chose you and you picked it up." "What are you talking about?" Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. "What game?" The old man shook his head, a gesture of deep, final finality. He bent down and retrieved his axe, his movements slow and tired. "Once you pick up his toy," the ranger said, his back now turned to them, "it means you've agreed to play, and in this forest, some games never end." He lifted the axe and brought it down on the chopping block with a heavy, percussive thud. "The only way to win," he said, not looking at them, "is to have never started." He offered no other explanation. He just continued to chop his wood, each thud of the axe a beat in a countdown they didn't understand. Mark and Sarah stood there for a long moment, the ranger's terrible, cryptic words echoing in the silent, watchful air. They had come for help and were instead given a prophecy of doom. The ranger's words were a death sentence, and they hung in the air between Mark and Sarah all the way back to their camp. The silence that had once been born of grief was now something sharper, colder. It was the silence of fear. They were no longer just a sad couple. They were players in a game they had never agreed to, governed by rules they didn't understand. As their campsite came into view, the small, lonely tent, the circle of dead ash, a grim resolve settled over Mark. The ranger's cryptic warnings weren't enough. He couldn't fight a ghost story. He needed something tangible, something real. He needed to see the board on which this terrible game was being played. "Stay here," he said to Sarah, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the terror that was churning in his gut. "Keep the fire going. I'm going to look at that tree." Sarah didn't protest. She just nodded, her eyes wide, clutching the small wooden bird to her chest as if it were a holy relic. Mark approached the hollow oak with the cautious, deliberate steps of a soldier entering a minefield. The closer he got, the colder the air became. The ambient sounds of the forest, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird seemed to die away, leaving only the sound of his own blood pounding in his ears. The hollow at the tree's base was a wound of absolute darkness, a gaping maw that seemed to exhale a faint, musty scent of damp earth and something else, something like old, forgotten tears. He pulled out his phone, the beam of its flashlight cutting a nervous white slash into the gloom. He crouched down and peered inside. At first, he saw only what he expected, a tangle of rotten leaves and the tattered, mildewed remains of what looked like a small, plaid shirt, confirming his worst fears. But as he pushed the beam of light deeper, his breath caught in his throat. The inside of the hollow was covered in them. Scratches. They weren't from an animal. They were the frantic, desperate gouges of human fingernails, hundreds of them, scarring the dark, smooth wood. They went in all directions, a chaotic testament to a small body thrashing in a confined space, a desperate primal scream rendered in wood. And carved among the scratches over and over and over again was a name. Leo, Leo, Leo. Some were neat, as if carved by a child with time on his hands. Others were violent and jagged, the frantic work of pure terror. Mark scrambled backward, kicking up dirt, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He finally understood. This wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a tomb. The ghost in this forest wasn't just a myth. It was the trapped, terrified spirit of a little boy who had died in this very tree, and the game they were in was rooted in the real, tangible horror of his final, lonely moments. While Mark was making his grim discovery at the hollow oak, Sarah remained at the campsite, a solitary figure in a clearing that felt far too large and exposed. She had tried to busy herself, to organize their gear, to do anything to keep the mounting panic at bay, but her hands wouldn't cooperate. Her attention kept returning to the small blue wooden bird she held, clutched in her palm. The ranger's words echoed in her mind. Once you pick up his toy, it means you've agreed to play. She stared at the object, turning it over and over. It was just a piece of wood, crudely carved and painted, something a child might have loved and lost. A wave of sympathy, sharp and painful, lanced through her. She understood loss. She understood being forgotten. That's when she felt the cold. It started in the center of her palm, right where the bird's smooth wooden belly rested. It was not the simple coolness of wood on a chilly autumn day. This was a deep, penetrating cold, a vampiric chill that seemed to be actively drawing the warmth out of her skin. She watched in horror as the cold spread, a web of icy tendrils snaking up her wrist and into her forearm. The bird felt like a piece of frozen iron, and it was draining the very life from her. A new potent fear, different from the dread she'd felt before, seized her. This object wasn't just a sad memento, it was a conduit. It was dangerous. I have to get rid of it, she thought, her mind screaming. Just throw it into the woods. She tried to open her hand. Her mind commanded her fingers to uncurl, to release the cursed thing, to hurl it as far as she possibly could. But her muscles refused to obey. Her fingers were locked in a death grip around the bird, clamped shut with a strength she didn't recognize as her own. She fought against herself, a grunt of effort and terror escaping her lips, but her hand was a traitor, a cage of her own flesh and bone. She didn't know if it was the ghost's power that held her fast, or if it was some dark, grieving part of her own soul, the mother who had lost a child, that refused to let go of this new, terrible connection to another lost boy. The line between the spirit's will and her own trauma had blurred into nothing. She was trapped, a prisoner of her own hand, as the little wooden bird continued its silent, icy feast on the warmth of her body. Night fell again, and this time there was no pretense of sleep. Mark and Sarah sat inside the zipped-up tent, a single, battery-powered lantern casting long, dancing shadows around them. They had pushed their heavy backpacks against the flap, a flimsy and pathetic barricade against the listening darkness. Every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. They were no longer camping. They were under siege, waiting for the next move from an opponent they couldn't see. They didn't have to wait long. The voice, when it came, was no longer a distant whisper. It was right outside the tent, as clear and present as if the speaker was standing just an inch away from the thin nylon wall. It was the same calm, childlike voice, but now it was filled with an eerie, playful authority. "My turn to hide," the voice stated simply. "You seek." Before they could even process the chilling command, another sound joined it. A slow, metallic zip. Mark's head snapped toward the tent flap. The zipper tab on its own was moving. Pulled from the outside by an invisible hand, it began its slow, deliberate descent, opening a widening vertical slit of absolute blackness into their fragile sanctuary. Primal fear gave way to a surge of adrenaline. "No!" Mark snarled, scrambling across the small space. He grabbed the inside of the zipper and pulled up with all his might. For a second, it held. He fought against the unseen pressure, his knuckles white, his teeth clenched. He was in a tug of war with a ghost, but the force on the other side was relentless. It was a calm, steady, and infinitely patient pull. He gained an inch, only to lose 2. The zipper rasped down again, the gap of darkness widening, the cold night air pouring in, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. He could hear Sarah crying behind him, a series of short, terrified gasps. He pulled again, his shoulder muscles screaming in protest, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the pressure vanished. The zipper shot up to the top, and Mark tumbled backward, landing in a heap at Sarah's feet. The tent was sealed once more. The silence that followed the struggle with the zipper was somehow more violent than the act itself. Mark was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, his body trembling with leftover adrenaline. He stared at the tent flap, at the simple metallic object that had just served as the battlefield in a war against the impossible. His mind was racing, trying to formulate a plan, a defense, anything a rational man could do against an enemy that defied all reason. But Sarah wasn't seeing the zipper. She wasn't seeing the flimsy nylon walls or her husband's terrified face. She was looking past it all into the deep, listening darkness outside. Mark saw a monster, an intruder trying to force its way in. But Sarah, in the deepest, most wounded corner of her heart, heard only a child. A lonely, desperate child who didn't know its own strength. A little boy who just wanted someone to stop fighting and play with him. Her grief was a powerful, distorting lens, twisting the terrifying reality into something she could almost understand, something her broken mother's heart could almost pity. She knew with a certainty that defied all logic that their fear was making it worse. Barricading the door was a rejection. Fighting back was an insult. In her grief-stricken mind, there was only one way to make the haunting stop. It wasn't to fight. It was to surrender. "Sarah, no!" Mark whispered, seeing the look on her face, the terrible dawning resignation in her eyes. "Don't even think it!" But his plea was too late. Leaning toward the tent flap, she spoke to the listening darkness, her voice a soft, broken whisper, a mother's tired sigh. "Okay," she breathed. "We'll play." The words were a death sentence, and the moment they left her lips, the forest responded. Instantly, the sound of the lullaby drifted through the night air, seeming to emanate directly from the direction of the hollow oak tree. But the melody was different now. The sorrow was gone, replaced by something horribly playful, a tinny, mocking tune like that of a wind-up toy. It was no longer a song of grief. It was the triumphant, terrible theme music of a game that had just been officially accepted. Mark ran back to the campsite, the ranger's horrifying story chasing him like a wolf at his heels. The woods, which had seemed merely silent and watchful before, now felt actively malevolent, every shadow holding the potential for a new, terrible trick. He had to get to Sarah. He had to make her understand the nature of the game they had been forced to play. He burst into the clearing, but she wasn't at the fire pit. His blood ran cold. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes landing on the one place he had prayed she would stay away from. She was standing near the hollow oak tree, her back to him. She was talking. Her voice was soft, the gentle, cooing tone a mother uses to soothe a frightened child. It was a voice Mark hadn't heard in over a year. "It's okay," she was saying to the empty air in front of the tree's dark, gaping mouth. "You don't have to hide. I'm not going to hurt you. What's your name, sweetie?" She held the small, wooden bird out in her palm, an offering. A wave of horror and fury washed over Mark. He rushed forward, grabbing her by the arm. "Sarah, what are you doing? Get away from there!" She spun around, her expression not one of fear, but of pure, unadulterated annoyance, as if he had just interrupted the most important conversation of her life. "Shh! Mark, stop! You're scaring him!" "Scaring who?" he yelled, his voice cracking. He shook her gently, trying to break the terrible spell she was under. "There's no one there, Sarah. Listen to me. That is not Josh." The name of their son, spoken aloud, hung in the cold air like a physical blow. Sarah flinched, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "Don't you say his name," she hissed. "I have to," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Because that's what this thing is feeding on. The ranger told me everything. It's a ghost, Sarah. A little boy named Leo who died right here playing a game. This isn't our son finding his way back to us. It's a lonely, angry spirit, and it's playing a game to trap us here with it. To snap out of it." He was trying to save her, trying to pull her back from the edge of a cliff made of her own grief. But their raw, powerful emotions, his terror and her sorrow, were like a dinner bell ringing in the silent forest. As they stood there, locked in their terrible struggle, a cold wind whipped through the clearing, and the shadows around the base of the hollow oak seemed to deepen, to writhe, to gather themselves into a new and hungry shape. The raw, powerful emotion of their argument, Mark's desperate terror, and Sarah's wounded, grieving denial, did not go unnoticed. It was exactly what the forest had been waiting for. It was a feast. As they stood there, locked in their personal tragedy, the shadows at the base of the hollow oak tree began to move. It wasn't a trick of the failing light. The darkness itself seemed to be gathering, pulling together from the surrounding woods, coalescing into a single, deeper patch of night. The temperature in the clearing plummeted, and the air grew thick and heavy like the moments before a thunderstorm. Slowly, the shadow began to rise. It took on a shape, small and vaguely human, the silhouette of a little boy made of pure, writhing darkness. Its edges were indistinct, smoky, and it had no discernible features, but its presence was as solid and real as the ancient tree from which it had been born. Mark and Sarah's argument died in their throats, replaced by a shared, silent scream. They were no longer fighting each other. They were united now, two small, terrified figures staring at the impossible thing that their grief had given form. The shadow child lifted one of its arms, the limb elongated, stretching into a long, thin, wavering finger, and it pointed. It didn't point at them. It pointed past them, away from the relative safety of the campsite, deeper into the dark, uncharted woods. It was pointing toward the direction of the ravine. Then a whisper slid out from the figure, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was clearer now, imbued with the power they had fed it. "Find me!" The command was simple, absolute. It was the next phase of the game. They finally understood. The hollow oak, Leo's hiding spot, wasn't just a haunted place. It was the heart of the game board, the anchor from which the lonely ghost could project its will. Their conflict had given it the strength to expand the board, to change the rules. They were no longer just being asked to play in the clearing. They were now being sent on a quest, a final, terrible round of hide-and-seek with a destination chosen by the dead. The shadow figure faded back into the hollow of the oak, but its command, "Find me," remained, an invisible brand on the cold night air. Mark and Sarah stood frozen for a long moment, the echo of that impossible whisper sealing their fate. There was no more debate, no more talk of escape. The game had a new objective, and they were the unwilling players. To stay here was to wait for death. To go forward was to walk directly into its embrace. Hesitantly, Mark took a step toward the path the shadow had indicated. As if on cue, a new phenomenon began. The small wooden bird which Sarah had dropped to the ground in her terror began to vibrate, emitting a low, resonant hum. It pulsed with a faint, pale blue light, and then, like the needle of a compass, it slowly turned, its beak pointing down the same dark, narrow trail. It was their guide, their first clue. With a shared look of grim resignation, they started walking, Sarah cautiously scooping up the humming, glowing bird. As they stepped onto the path, the forest around them began to change. Although the night sky above was clear and dotted with a million cold stars, they heard the unmistakable rumble of distant thunder. The air grew heavy and thick with the smell of ozone and coming rain. Ghostly images flickered at the edges of their vision. For a terrifying second, they saw the fleeting impressions of a child's small, panicked footprints appearing in the mud before vanishing as if they had never been. A sudden, silent flash of lightning illuminated the woods, revealing a world of stark, terrified trees, but no storm followed. A cold, phantom mist descended upon them, clinging to their clothes and chilling them to the bone, though the air itself remained dry. They understood then. They weren't just following a path. They were walking through a memory. The ghost of Leo was making the rules of its final game brutally clear. They had to follow the trail of his last, terrified moments on Earth. Each supernatural event, each ghostly echo of the coming storm was another breadcrumb on the path to his final hiding spot. They were no longer just players in a game. They were actors in a tragedy, forced to reenact the final desperate scene of a little boy lost in the woods. The ghostly trail led them deeper into the woods, and with every step, the rules of the final game became clearer, not through words, but through a growing, instinctual dread. They were walking through the memory of Leo's final hour, and a terrible sense of a ticking clock began to press in on them. The phantom thunder grew louder, closer, and they understood that the end of this spectral storm would coincide with the coming of the real dawn. That was their deadline. The penalty for failure was made clear to them in the most horrifying way imaginable. At the edges of their vision, in the deepest parts of the woods, illuminated by the phantom lightning, they began to see flickers of movement. Translucent, shimmering figures stood half hidden behind the trees, their forms indistinct and wavering. They were pale and sad-looking, their eyes hollow with an eternal loneliness. Mark and Sarah realized with a wave of absolute terror that they weren't just being haunted by Leo. They were being watched by the silent, ghostly audience of all the other players who had been invited to his game and had lost. To fail, to refuse to play, was to join their ranks and stay in the silent forest forever. And then the lullaby changed. It was still the same simple, sorrowful tune, but now woven between the notes were whispers. A child's voice, carried on the wind, singing cryptic, taunting clues. "Where the fallen giant sleeps," the ghost child whispered, and the humming bird in Sarah's hand pulsed, pointing them toward a massive, uprooted tree. As they scrambled over it, the voice returned, a little closer this time. "Where the cold, dark water weeps, follow now, on tired feet." The bird's light guided them toward the sound of a gurgling creek. The whispers were no longer just clues, they were a torment, a constant reminder of their progress in this terrible game. "You're getting warmer," the voice would hum. "But you're running out of time. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." They were no longer in control. They were pawns on a board made of memory and dread, guided by the light of a cursed toy, and hurried along by the taunting clues in a dead boy's song. The final game was in full play, and they had no choice but to follow the rules. The ghostly lullaby grew more frantic, the whispered clues coming faster, overlapping with the crashing of the phantom thunder. The hummingbird in Sarah's hand pulsed with a desperate, urgent light, pulling them forward through the disorienting chaos of the dying memory. The final clue was a single, sorrowful line sung on the wind. "Where the rocks weep and I sleep." The trail ended abruptly. It simply ceased to exist, opening onto a dizzying precipice. They had reached the edge of a deep, dark ravine, a jagged wound carved into the heart of the forest. A cold, heavy mist coiled in its depths, and the phantom wind howled around them, a mournful, lonely sound. The spectral storm was directly overhead now, the air thick with an energy that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. This was it, the place where Leo's story had ended. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back from the slick, mossy edge. He peered down into the churning mist below, his eyes white. And then he saw him. The ghost of Leo was standing at the bottom of the ravine. He wasn't a shadow anymore. He looked solid, real. A little boy in a plaid shirt and muddy jeans, his face pale in the gloom. He wasn't crying or screaming. He was looking up at them and he was smiling. A wide, happy, innocent smile, as if they were the first friendly faces he had seen in a very, very long time. Then he lifted his small hand and waved, a cheerful, inviting gesture. The terrible final truth of the game crashed down upon Mark and Sarah with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a game of hide and seek. It was a game of recruitment. The final hiding spot. The only way to find him, the only way to win, was to join him, to step off the edge, to fall into the darkness, to end their game the same way his had ended. The prize for winning was an eternity of playing in the dark. Another sad, translucent figure in the lonely ghost's collection. The sight of the lonely, smiling boy was a poisoned dart aimed directly at Sarah's grieving heart. Her breath hitched in a sob, and she took a faltering step toward the edge, her eyes locked on the figure below. For a terrible moment, Mark thought she was going to follow, mesmerized by the ghost of a child who looked so much like the one she had lost. The game had reached its end, and the ghost was patiently waiting for them to come and claim their prize. Mark's desperate plea barely registered. Sarah stood at the precipice, her entire being focused on the small, smiling boy at the bottom of the ravine. The sight of him was an agony, a perfect, terrible echo of everything she had lost. The ghost's loneliness called out to the gaping, hollow wound in her own soul, and for a heart-stopping moment, the pull was almost irresistible. To step off the edge felt less like a death and more like a homecoming. But as she looked down, something in her finally broke. It was not her spirit. It was her delusion. Through the fog of her own grief, she finally saw him not as a replacement for the son she had lost, but as what he truly was. Another mother's lost boy. A spirit trapped in its own endless, lonely tragedy. His game wasn't born of malice, but of a loneliness so profound it had become a monstrous, hungry thing. And her sorrow was its favorite meal. She felt Mark's hands gripping her arm, trying to pull her back to safety. She stopped struggling. She planted her feet firmly on the damp earth, a few feet from the crumbling edge. She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked down at the waiting ghost. She would not play his game. She would end it. Her voice, when it came, was not a scream of terror, but a sound of heartbreaking beauty. She began to sing. She sang the lullaby. It was no longer the absent-minded hum from the first night, nor the taunting, ghostly melody that had haunted them through the woods. This was the real song, full of all the love and all the pain she held for her own lost son. She poured every ounce of her grief, every shattered memory, into that simple, sorrowful tune. The phantom storm raging around them seemed to quiet, the howling wind softening to a whisper, as if the forest itself was pausing to listen. Down below, the smile on Leo's spectral face began to falter. The cheerful waves stopped. He stood there, his small form growing still, his head tilted as if listening to a sound he thought he had forgotten forever. Sarah wasn't playing the part of a new victim. She was offering the one thing the ghost's endless, lonely game could never provide, not a playmate in death, but a mother's comfort and a final, peaceful goodbye. The last, sorrowful note of the lullaby faded into the now peaceful quiet of the grove. The phantom storm had vanished, the howling wind replaced by a gentle, sighing breeze. Down below, the ghost of the little boy stood perfectly still, his head tilted, his expression no longer one of manic, lonely invitation, but of pure, profound confusion. The game's logic had been broken, and he didn't know what to do next. Mark watched, his hand still hovering near Sarah's arm, as she slowly knelt at the very edge of the precipice. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She was no longer a player in the ghost's game. She was ending it. She took the small wooden bird from her pocket. For a moment she just looked at it. This sad, broken toy that had been the source of so much terror, this symbol of a lost child. Then, with a tenderness that was almost unbearable to watch, she reached out and gently placed it on the damp moss at the edge of the ravine. She wasn't throwing it away. She was returning it. She looked down into the ravine one last time, her gaze meeting the ghosts. Her voice was clear and steady, filled not with fear, but with an immense, heartbreaking compassion. "The game is over, Leo," she said softly. It was an act of grace, a unilateral declaration that the rules had changed. She was not a playmate to be captured, nor an enemy to be defeated. In that final moment, she was simply a mother offering a final, gentle comfort to a lost child. The ghost's endless, cruel game could not account for an act of pure, selfless empathy. Leo looked from the wooden bird back to Sarah. The confusion on his spectral face slowly melted away, replaced by a faint, peaceful smile. It was the first genuine expression they had seen from him. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then he began to fade, his small form growing translucent, dissolving into the cool morning mist like a half-forgotten dream until nothing was left at all. The little wooden bird sat alone on the edge of the ravine, a final, silent testament to the game that had been played. As the last shimmering motes of the ghost's form dissipated into the cool morning air, a profound quiet settled over the grove. The world seemed to hold its breath for a long, still moment, and then, slowly, it began to exhale. The sun crested the ridge and the first real warm rays of dawn sliced through the trees, chasing away the lingering phantom chill. Mark and Sarah stood there, side by side, their bodies trembling with a bone-deep exhaustion that was more than physical. They had survived. They had faced the lonely ghost and had walked away. But they both understood the terrible truth of their victory. The price of their survival had been a forced march through the landscape of their own worst pain. The ghost of Leo, in its desperate, lonely game, had forced them to confront the very grief they had come to the woods to escape. It had made Sarah sing the one song her heart had locked away. It had made Mark witness his wife teeter on the edge of an abyss, a mirror of the emotional precipice they had both been living on for the past year. They were free from the ghost, but they would be forever haunted by the memory of the game. They had come to the forest to run from a ghost in their home, only to be saved by confronting a ghost in the woods. The entity had demanded a price, and they had paid it, not with their lives, but with their carefully constructed walls of denial and silence. Slowly, as if moving underwater, Sarah turned away from the ravine and collapsed into Mark's arms. He held her tightly, the two of them clutching each other, no longer two separate islands of grief, but two survivors clinging to the same piece of wreckage. They had won the ghost's final game, but the scars would last a lifetime. As they fled from the grove, something had changed. The forest was no longer a labyrinth. The oppressive, hostile presence that had been dogging their steps, turning them in circles and playing with their minds, was gone. The path back to the car was now insultingly clear, the red trail markers they had lost yesterday, now visible on the trees, seeming to mock them with their simple, logical guidance. The game was over, and the park was now showing them the door. The sun, which had felt distant and cold, now seemed a little warmer on their skin. The woods were just woods again, a collection of trees and rocks and dirt, and this sudden return to normalcy was the most terrifying thing of all. It was the indifferent silence of a predator that has finished its meal and returned to its slumber. They walked without speaking, 3 separate islands of misery moving in the same direction. The sounds of their own footsteps, the rasp of their breathing, were deafening in the quiet. They didn't look at each other. To look at each other would be to see their own failure, their own guilt, reflected in another's eyes. They were no longer friends. They were co-conspirators in a tragedy, bound by a secret that would forever keep them apart. Ben's ghost walked between them, a tangible presence in the empty spaces. The sight of the SUV parked where they had left it was a surreal shock. It was a relic from another world, a world of paved roads and cell service and rules that made sense. A world they had left behind 2 days ago, but which now felt like a lifetime away. The sound of the car doors clicking shut felt like the closing of a tomb. For a moment they just sat there, encased in metal and glass, the familiar smell of stale coffee and air freshener, a bizarre comfort. Then Liam, his movements stiff and mechanical, put the key in the ignition. The engine turned over with a roar that felt like a sacrilege in the quiet woods, and he put the car in reverse, leaving Whispering Gorge to its ancient, hungry silence. They were leaving, but they all knew with a certainty that settled in their bones that they weren't truly escaping. A part of them would be left behind forever in that dark, silent grove, and a part of the woods would now sit in the empty seat beside them, a passenger for the rest of their lives. The drive was a long, hollow silence, each of them trapped in the wreckage of their own thoughts. Maya stared out the window, but she wasn't seeing the passing trees. She was seeing the rule board. She, the planner, the one who believed in order and preparation, had been useless. Her meticulous plans and anxious warnings had been nothing but a child's scribbles against a hurricane. Her guilt was a cold, heavy thing. It wasn't just that Ben was dead, it was that her entire world-view, her belief in control, had been a lie. The rules hadn't saved them, they had only been a more structured way to be devoured. Chloe sat huddled in the back, her hands tucked under her legs as if to keep them from ever picking up a pencil again. The thing she had loved most in the world, her art, had become a cursed object. Her need to capture beauty had been twisted into an act of sacrilege that had cost their friend his life. The image of the weeping stone, its tears turning to blood, was burned into her mind. She knew she would see it every time she closed her eyes. And Liam, his hands gripping the steering wheel, felt the crushing weight of his own inaction. He had been the observer, the quiet center, while his friends had orbited around him in a frantic dance of panic and denial. He had seen it all coming, had felt the wrongness from the very beginning, and he had done nothing. He had said nothing. He had come to the woods to escape the pain of a broken heart, only to watch as his entire world of friendship was broken in front of him, and he had simply stood by and let it happen. The car sped down the highway, carrying 3 survivors back to a world that would no longer make sense. The entity in Whispering Gorge had only taken 1 life, but it had killed something far deeper, the friendship that had brought them there in the first place. The silence in the car was its final, most enduring trophy. Weeks passed. The world tried to convince Maya that Whispering Gorge had never happened. The city was loud and alive, a constant symphony of traffic, sirens, and the muffled sounds of neighbours living their lives through thin apartment walls. It was a world of concrete and electricity, a world that left no room for impossible forests or things that hunted in the dark. Maya clung to this normalcy with a desperate, ferocious grip. She worked longer hours. She cleaned her small apartment until it was sterile, every object in its proper place, every surface gleaming. She was rebuilding the fences of order and control around herself, trying to prove that the world still made sense. She hadn't spoken to Liam or Chloe since the day they'd returned. There had been no tearful phone calls, no attempts to make sense of the unspeakable. What was there to say? Their shared silence was a testament to the chasm that had opened between them, a silent acknowledgement that the friendship was another body they had left behind in those woods. Some nights she could almost convince herself it had been a shared psychosis, a terrible collective nightmare brought on by stress and isolation. They were just four grieving friends who had gotten lost and let their imaginations run wild. It was a comforting lie, a story she told herself as she lay awake at night, listening to the familiar senseless rules of the city, trying to forget the ones that had been written in wood and stone. But the lie was thin, and it always tore apart the moment she closed her eyes. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, the package arrived. It was a small, unassuming cardboard box left by the mailman outside her apartment door. It was damp from the rain, and her name and address were written on it in a strange and spidery, almost scratchy script. There was no return address. She carried it inside, her heart thudding with a slow, heavy rhythm she hadn't felt since the drive home. She told herself it was from one of the others. An apology, an explanation, a peace offering. She slid a kitchen knife under the packing tape, the sound unnaturally loud in her quiet apartment. Inside, there was no bubble wrap or tissue paper. The object rested on a bed of dried, fragrant pine needles and dark, crumbly moss. It was a small, flat piece of wood, looking as if it had been peeled directly from the bark of an ancient tree. The carving was rough, jagged. The letters looked as though they had been gouged into the surface with a shard of rock. It was a new rule, the final rule. It said, 7, never tell anyone about this place. The piece of wood slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the floor. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it had followed her home. The rule wasn't a warning. It was a threat, a gag order delivered from a nightmare she thought she had escaped. It knew who she was. It knew where she lived. And in that moment of stark, paralyzing terror, she heard it. The sound was impossible, a beautiful, terrible lie in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. It cut through the distant wail of a police siren and the drumming of the rain against her window. It was the clear, melodious and perfectly inhuman sound of a flute-like whistle, the triumphant song of a successful hunt. It was coming from right outside her third-story window. Maya stood frozen in the middle of her clean, orderly living room, a prisoner once more. She had escaped the forest, but she now understood that the forest was not a place. It was a set of rules. And the game was not over. A new one, with no visible borders and no one to hear her scream, had just begun. A long, silent pause for at least 90 seconds. Childhood games are strange, sacred things, aren't they? They're our first introduction to a world with rules, a world of make-believe, governed by a logic that only makes sense until the streetlights come on. We learn to hide, to seek, to chase, to be caught. But there's always a little bit of darkness lingering at the edges of the playing field. Hide and seek, especially. The thrill of that game isn't just in finding a good hiding spot. It's the quiet terror of waiting in the dark. It's the fear of not being found at all, of being left alone after everyone else has gone home. The fear of being forgotten. Loneliness is its own kind of monster, and sometimes it finds its way into the games we play, twisting them into something new, something hungry. It can turn a cheerful call of "ready or not, here I come" into a genuine threat. It makes me wonder, and I'd love to hear from all of you. What was a childhood game that genuinely scared you? Was it the deepening darkness during a game of hide and seek? A strange, unspoken rule in a game of make-believe? Or maybe a spooky story you and your friends told that started to feel a little too real? Share your story in the comments below. There's a strange sort of comfort in sharing these memories. A way of proving the ghosts of the past don't have quite as much power over us as we think. If you appreciate these journeys into the darker side of memory, I hope you'll consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell. It ensures you'll never miss the next story we have to share. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay safe and be careful what games you agree to play.